August 5th, 1944. The air inside the Supreme Commander's trailer is thick with cigar smoke and the suffocating weight of an alliance on the brink of rupture. Outside, the machinery of the largest invasion force in history grinds relentlessly toward the German border. Inside, the Prime Minister of Great Britain is weeping. Winston Churchill, the man whose voice had rallied a civilization against darkness, is no longer commanding. He is pleading. For 6 hours he has badgered, cajoled, and threatened General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Churchill is demanding the cancellation of Operation Anvil, the invasion of southern France. He calls it a mistake. He calls it a betrayal. He implies that history itself will condemn the Americans for their stubbornness. Eisenhower, seated across the narrow table, does not shout back. He does not offer a compromise. He simply waits for the Prime Minister to finish, his face set in the granite expression that his staff has come to fear. The silence that follows is not the silence of agreement. It is the silence of a changing guard. At this moment, the balance of the world has shifted, and the British Empire is about to be told no. To understand the crushing weight of that silence in August 1944, one must look back to the noise and bravado of December 1941, when the relationship between Washington and London was forged in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Winston Churchill arrived in the American capital, not merely as an ally, but as a tutor coming to instruct a wealthy but inexperienced pupil. He swept into the White House with the air of a man who had stood alone against the Nazi tide for 2 years, bringing with him a retinue of battle-hardened generals and admirals who viewed their American counterparts with a mixture of relief and condescension. At the Arcadia Conference, the dynamic was unmistakable. The British delegation, led by the formidable chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, presented polished, intricate strategies. They spoke the language of global empire, moving divisions across maps of the Mediterranean, India, and the Middle East with practiced ease. The Americans, led by General George Marshall, were scrambling to mobilize a nation that had been asleep. They had the manpower and the industrial potential, but they lacked the strategic scar tissue that the British had earned at Dunkirk and in the skies during the Blitz. In these early days, Dwight Eisenhower was a relatively obscure brigadier general working in the War Plans Division, largely unseen in the shadow of giants like Marshall. He observed a clear reality. The British possessed the strategic initiative. They convinced President Roosevelt that a direct assault on Nazi-occupied Europe, the American preference, was impossible in 1942. Instead, they spun a narrative of peripheral warfare, a strategy of pecking at the edges of the German Reich to bleed it dry before delivering the killing blow. This was the British way of war, honed over centuries of managing a maritime empire. It prioritized the preservation of manpower and the protection of imperial lifelines through the Mediterranean. The Americans, by contrast, culturally and doctrinally favored the direct approach, massing overwhelming force and striking the enemy's center of gravity immediately. But in 1942, American factories were not yet at full capacity, and their armies were green. When Churchill argued that an invasion of France would result in a river of Allied blood, the Americans had no choice but to listen. The result was Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942. It was a British strategic victory, fought largely with American resources. General Marshall had vehemently opposed it, arguing it was a distraction that would delay the liberation of Europe by years. Yet, Roosevelt overruled his generals in favor of Churchill's eloquence. The Prime Minister had secured American obedience through the sheer force of his experience and personality. Eisenhower, placed in command of this new theatre, found himself acting less as a warrior and more as a chairman of a volatile board. He spent his days smoothing over rifts between British determination and American impetuousness, often deferring to the seasoned British commanders under him, like Harold Alexander and Bernard Montgomery. He was learning the art of coalition warfare, but he was doing so from a position of deference. The British guided his hand, corrected his tactical assumptions, and often dictated the pace of the advance. As 1942 bled into 1943, the Allied armies pushed the Panzer Army Africa into the sea, but the precedent had been set. The British proposed the strategy. The Americans provided the trucks and the men. Churchill believed this arrangement was the natural order of things. Brain and brawn working in tandem, with London providing the brain. He assumed that as long as the war continued, the Americans would defer to the superior wisdom of the British Empire. But beneath the surface of this successful partnership, the tectonic plates of the alliance were beginning to grind. The American industrial machine was finally waking up. Liberty ships were sliding down slipways at a rate the world had never seen, and millions of American draftees were finishing their training. The junior partner was growing exponentially stronger by the day, while Britain, exhausted by 3 years of total war, was reaching the absolute limits of its manpower reserves. The era of British tutelage was drawing to a close, even if Winston Churchill refused to see it. The shift was physical before it was political. Throughout 1943, the Atlantic Ocean became a highway of steel. Operation Bolero, the buildup of American forces in the United Kingdom, turned the British Isles into a massive floating aircraft carrier. Every day, thousands of GIs poured off transports in Liverpool and Southampton, bringing with them a culture of abundance that stunned the rationed British populace. They brought lucky strikes, nylon stockings, and jeeps, but more importantly, they brought the undeniable reality of numbers. By the end of the year, the American presence in Europe was no longer a supplementary force. It was the main event. With this surge in material power came a hardening of American strategic resolve. General Marshall and his protege, Eisenhower, looked at the map of Europe with the cold logic of logistics. To them, the war was a math problem. The German heartland lay to the north. The shortest distance between London and Berlin was across the English Channel and through the plains of France. Every soldier sent to fight in the mountains of Italy or the islands of the Mediterranean was, in their view, a soldier subtracted from the decisive front. Churchill, however, remained haunted by the ghosts of the Somme. He viewed the English Channel not as a highway, but as a moat filled with blood. He argued passionately for what he called the soft underbelly of the Axis. He wanted to push further up the Italian peninsula, to launch amphibious assaults in the Aegean Sea, and potentially to thrust into the Balkans. His arguments were clothed in military necessity, but they were driven by a desperate political foresight. Churchill saw the Soviet steamroller advancing from the east. He knew that if the Western Allies did not meet the Russians as far east as possible, in Vienna, in Prague, in Budapest, half of Europe would trade one tyranny for another. The tension came to a head in November 1943 in the cold, dusty embassy rooms of Tehran. For the first time, the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, sat at the same table. It was here that the geopolitical landscape fractured. Stalin, looking for a second front to relieve the pressure on the Red Army, asked a simple cutting question. Who will command this Operation Overlord? When told that no commander had yet been selected, he was dismissive. But more importantly, Stalin threw his massive weight behind the American strategy. He wanted the Allies in France, not in the Balkans. Roosevelt, seeking to build a rapport with the Soviet leader, sided with Stalin against his old friend. Churchill found himself outflanked, his strategic vision dismantled by the combined pressure of Washington and Moscow. He was forced to agree to a definitive date for the invasion of France, May 1944. The Peripheral Strategy was effectively dead. On his way back from this diplomatic defeat, Roosevelt made the decision that would seal the fate of the alliance's leadership. He had originally intended to give the command of Overlord to George Marshall, keeping Eisenhower in Washington. But the president realized he could not spare Marshall from the capital. He told Eisenhower, "I feel I cannot sleep at night with you out of the country." The mantle of Supreme Allied Commander fell to Eisenhower. When Eisenhower arrived in London in January 1944 to take command, he was no longer the deferential junior partner of North Africa. He was the commander of the greatest amphibious force ever assembled, armed with a mandate from the President and the Premier of the Soviet Union to strike the heart of Germany. He carried the authority to make decisions that could topple empires. Yet he was about to discover that the hardest battles would not be fought against the Wehrmacht, but against the very men standing on his own side of the map. To understand why the confrontation in August 1944 was inevitable, we must first understand that Eisenhower and Churchill were fighting two different wars. Winston Churchill did not look at a map of northern France the way other men did. Where his generals saw beaches and road networks, the Prime Minister saw a graveyard. He was a man of the Victorian age, a cavalry officer who had charged at Omdurman, but his soul had been seared by the First World War. He had watched a generation of British youth march into the machine guns of the Somme and Passchendaele, and he had personally authorized the disastrous amphibious assault at Gallipoli in 1915. That failure haunted him. It lived in him. The prospect of sending another British army directly into the teeth of prepared German fortifications across the English Channel terrified him. In his private moments, he confessed to visions of the Channel running red with Allied blood. His strategy was one of evasion and opportunism, using the Royal Navy's dominance to strike where the enemy was weak, not where he was strong. He wanted to pull the German army apart, stretching them thin across the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and Norway, until they collapsed from exhaustion. For Churchill, a direct assault was a gamble with the very existence of the British nation. Dwight Eisenhower, conversely, viewed war through the windshield of a supply truck. He was not a combat veteran of the trenches. He was a master of organization, a staff officer who understood that modern war was decided by tonnage, fuel flow, and industrial output. To Eisenhower, the peripheral strategy favored by the British was a logistical nightmare. It required maintaining multiple long supply lines through jagged terrain where tanks could not maneuver, and air power was limited by mountains. His philosophy was brutally simple. The German war machine was powered by the industries of the Ruhr Valley and directed from Berlin. The United States Army was designed as a blunt instrument, a sledgehammer, not a rapier. It relied on mass, firepower, and speed. You do not use a sledgehammer to peck at the edges. You swing it at the center. Eisenhower argued that every day spent fighting in Italy or discussing invasions of the Balkans gave the Germans time to build more jet fighters, more V weapons, and better defenses in France. To the Americans, the British caution looked less like wisdom and more like a loss of nerve. There was a third, unspoken dimension to this clash. Churchill was fighting for the post-war world. He looked at the map and saw the Soviet Union devouring Eastern Europe. He knew that if the Western Allies were bogged down in France while Stalin marched into Vienna and Berlin, the balance of power in Europe would be lost for a century. His obsession with an attack through the Ljubljana Gap toward Vienna was a desperate attempt to cut off the Russian advance. Eisenhower, however, was bound by the strict orders of the combined chiefs of staff. Enter the continent of Europe, and in conjunction with the other United Nations, undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. His mandate was military, not political. He was forbidden from sacrificing American lives for British imperial interests or vague geopolitical gambling. He had a job to do, and he intended to finish it the fastest way possible. The friction between the two nations was personified on the battlefield by Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Monty was the hero of El Alamein, the most famous British soldier of the war, and a man of colossal vanity. He treated Eisenhower not as a superior, but as a well-meaning amateur, a board chairman who should handle the politics while the real soldiers fought the battles. Montgomery's tactical style was the physical embodiment of Churchill's caution: meticulous preparation, massive artillery support, and set-piece battles designed to minimize risk. He refused to move until every gaiter button was fastened and every shell was stockpiled. To the Americans, who favored aggression, improvisation, and movement, Montgomery's pace was maddeningly slow. Eisenhower often found himself acting as a buffer between his furious American generals, like Omar Bradley and George Patton, who wanted to race for the Rhine, and the methodical British field marshal who insisted on tidying up the battlefield before advancing. This clash of personalities was constant kindling for the strategic fire burning between London and Washington. Beneath the arguments about strategy lay a grim demographic reality that Churchill tried to hide, but Eisenhower clearly saw. Britain was running out of men. By the summer of 1944, the United Kingdom had been fighting total war for nearly 5 years. They had mobilized every able-bodied male. There were no more reserves. If a British infantry division was chewed up in Normandy, it could not be replaced. It had to be disbanded to provide replacements for others. This terrified Churchill. He knew that if the war turned into a slugging match of attrition, Britain would be broken, not just militarily, but biologically. This fear drove his obsession with cancelling operations he deemed unnecessary, specifically Operation Anvil. He wanted to concentrate all available forces in one theatre to end the war quickly, or divert them to Italy, where the pace was slower. Eisenhower, conversely, commanded a force that was still growing. The United States was drafting thousands of fresh men every month. The American doctrine could afford to be direct, even wasteful, if it secured victory. The tragedy of the alliance in 1944 was that the British needed the war to end carefully, while the Americans simply needed it to end now. Finally, there was the specific bone of contention that would break the camel's back. Operation Anvil, later renamed Dragoon. This was the plan to invade southern France via the Riviera in August 1944. The strategic logic was sound. Seize the massive ports of Marseille and Toulon to pump supplies to the main Allied armies in the north. To Eisenhower, Anvil was non-negotiable. The Normandy ports were destroyed or overcrowded. Without Marseille, his armies would stall for lack of fuel. But to Churchill, Anvil was a disaster. It required pulling veteran troops out of Italy, his preferred theatre, and sending them to a secondary front in France. He viewed it as abandoning the strategic initiative in the Mediterranean for a logistical convenience. He spent the summer of 1944 writing endless, frantic telegrams to Roosevelt, trying to bypass Eisenhower. But Roosevelt was dying, and his replies were brief. "I leave the decision to the Supreme Commander." The buck had stopped. The political cover was gone. The decision now rested entirely on the shoulders of the man from Kansas. July 1944. The liberation of Europe has stalled in the mud and blood of the bocage. In Normandy, the Great Crusade has devolved into a savage, yard-by-yard struggle for hedgerows. Ancient earthen banks topped with tangled roots that stop tanks dead and provide perfect cover for German machine guns. The optimism of D-Day has evaporated. The city of Caen, which Montgomery had promised to take on the first day, remains in German hands for over a month, a smoking ruin consumed by artillery fire. The British Second Army is bleeding out, grinding against the elite panzer divisions of the SS. For Eisenhower, the pressure is physical. The invasion force is trapped in a narrow beachhead. He needs room to maneuver, but more critically, he needs supplies. The artificial mulberry harbors built on the beaches have been wrecked by a freak channel storm. The Allies are bringing in thousands of tons of supplies over open sand, a logistical miracle that cannot last into the autumn. Eisenhower looks at the map and sees one solution: Marseille. The great port in southern France is the only facility capable of feeding the voracious appetite of his armies. Operation Anvil is no longer just a plan, it is a lifeline. But for Winston Churchill, the stalemate in Normandy is proof that the American strategy is failing. He sees an opening to kill the operation he hates. Throughout July, the telegrams flying between London and Eisenhower's headquarters become toxic. Churchill argues that stripping the Italian front of its best units, specifically the battle-hardened American Sixth Corps and the French Expeditionary Corps, to invade the Riviera is madness. Why, he demands, should we march into the blossoming vineyards of the Riviera when we could be striking the soft underbelly of the beast? He proposes wild alternatives: sending the troops to the Balkans to check the Soviets, or diverting them to the Brittany coast at St. Malo. Eisenhower remains polite, but firm. He refuses to debate strategy by telegram. He cites the agreements made at Tehran. He cites the orders of the combined chiefs. But Churchill is relentless. He leverages every ounce of his prestige. He travels to Eisenhower's headquarters at Southwick House. He invites Eisenhower to lengthy alcohol-fueled dinners, where he monologues for hours, mixing tears with thunderous condemnation. He warns Eisenhower that if Anvil proceeds, it will be the first major strategic error of the war. The tension breaks on August 5th, 1944. Churchill arrives at Eisenhower's mobile headquarters, code-named Shellburst, nestled in an apple orchard near Tournier, France. The Prime Minister is not there to discuss. He is there to command. He believes that, as the elder statesman, he can bully the nice Kansas boy into submission one last time. The meeting is private, intense, and historically decisive. Churchill throws everything on the table. He threatens that the British people will not forgive this waste of resources. He hints that he might resign. He implies that Eisenhower is betraying the spirit of the alliance. It is the desperate final gamble of an imperial lion who realizes the jungle is no longer his. For a moment, the silence in the trailer is deafening. The air is stale with smoke. Churchill, chest heaving, stares at the general, waiting for the crack in the armor. The nod of capitulation he has seen from Americans so many times before. But Dwight Eisenhower does not blink. He does not raise his voice. He does not engage in a debate about the history of the Balkans or the future of the British Empire. Instead, he leans forward and speaks with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Prime Minister," he says, "I have been given a directive by the combined chiefs of staff to defeat the German armies in the West. I intend to do so." He explains with the precision of an engineer that without the ports of southern France, the Allied advance will run out of gas before it reaches the Rhine. He tells Churchill that he will not condemn his soldiers to fight with empty rifles to satisfy a political gamble in the Mediterranean. Churchill tries to interrupt, to pivot back to his vision of Vienna, but Eisenhower cuts him off. He plays the trump card that has been building since 1941. "I am the supreme commander," Eisenhower states. He reminds the Prime Minister that the vast majority of the troops, the tanks, the ships, and the money now flowing into Europe are American. The time for committee decisions is over. The decision is his alone. And the decision is no. It is the moment the special relationship changes forever. The British Prime Minister, the man who held the line when the world was dark, sits back in his chair, deflated. He realizes that the power to dictate global strategy has left London. It now resides in the hands of this pragmatic man from Kansas. Eisenhower's refusal is absolute. He does not ask for permission. He informs Churchill that the invasion will proceed as planned on August 15th. Churchill, defeated, reportedly looks at Eisenhower with a mixture of resentment and begrudging respect. He mutters a dark warning that history will prove you wrong, but he knows the argument is over. He leaves the trailer not as the master of the alliance, but as its guest. 10 days later, under the cover of a massive naval bombardment, the ramp doors of American landing craft drop into the warm waters of the French Riviera. Operation Dragoon has begun. History, as it turned out, did not wait long to deliver its verdict. On the morning of August 15th, 1944, the catastrophe Churchill had predicted failed to materialize. Instead of a bloody stalemate, the landings in southern France were a masterpiece of military precision. The German defenses, hollowed out by the need to reinforce Normandy, crumbled under the weight of the assault. American and Free French forces swept ashore with casualties that were shockingly light compared to the butcher's bill of Omaha Beach. Within days, they had secured the beachhead. Within 2 weeks, they had liberated the great ports of Marseille and Toulon. The speed of the advance was breathtaking. The United States 7th Army and the French 1st Army raced up the Rhone Valley, devouring mile after mile of French countryside, capturing tens of thousands of German prisoners who were too stunned to fight. But the true vindication lay in the logistics. Eisenhower's math had been correct. By late autumn, the ports of southern France were handling over 1/3 of all Allied supplies on the continent. The gasoline that powered General Patton's tanks during the Battle of the Bulge did not come from Normandy. It came from the Mediterranean, through the very ports Churchill had fought so hard to ignore. Without Operation Dragoon, the Allied armies would have ground to a halt long before they reached the German border. Even Churchill, ever the showman, could not resist the spectacle. He arrived off the coast of the Riviera on a British destroyer to watch the landings he had tried to kill. Seeing the success, he rapidly changed his tune, telegraphing the king to describe the operation as brilliant. But privately, the lesson had been learned. The American sledgehammer had worked. The era of the indirect approach was dead. The success of Operation Dragoon did more than secure a supply line. It signaled the definitive end of the British Empire as an equal military partner. From August 1944 onward, the strategic direction of the war was dictated almost exclusively from Washington. The special relationship remained, but the hierarchy was now undeniable. America was the commander, and Britain was the lieutenant. This dynamic played out one final tragic time in the spring of 1945. As the Allied armies broke out of the Rhineland and surged into the heart of Germany, the road to Berlin lay open. The German army in the west had effectively disintegrated. Winston Churchill, seeing the Red Army closing in from the east, pleaded with Eisenhower to race for the German capital. "We should shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible," he urged. For Churchill, taking Berlin was not about ending the war. It was about defining the peace. He knew that if the Soviets took the capital, they would hold the psychological and political keys to post-war Europe. But Dwight Eisenhower once again looked at the map with the eyes of a soldier, not a statesman. He knew that the occupation zones had already been decided by the politicians at the Yalta Conference. Berlin was destined to be in the Soviet zone. Why, he reasoned, should he spend 10,000 American lives to capture a pile of rubble that he would simply have to hand over to Stalin a few weeks later? On April 12, 1945, the day President Roosevelt died, Eisenhower made the decision that would define the Cold War. He ordered his armies to halt at the Elbe River. He sent a telegram directly to Stalin, informing him of the stop line, effectively yielding Berlin to the Red Army. Churchill was apoplectic. He called it a tragedy for the future of democracy. But he was powerless to stop it. The British armies were exhausted, their manpower reserves utterly depleted. They could not race to Berlin alone. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reality was stark. The United States stood as the undisputed titan of the West, its industries intact, its armies triumphant. Britain was bankrupt, battered, and subordinate. The no in the trailer in August 1944 had been the turning point. It was the moment the United States accepted the burden of superpower status, stepping out from the shadow of its parent nation to shape the world on its own terms. In the end, the story of the alliance between Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower is not merely a chronicle of military strategy. It is a tragedy of succession. It is the story of a father realizing that his son has grown too strong to be controlled, and the painful necessity of the son realizing he must ignore the father to save the family. Churchill was a man of the 19th century, a romantic who believed in the power of rhetoric, the glory of empire, and the art of the indirect maneuver. He fought to preserve a world that was already vanishing in the smoke of the Blitz. Eisenhower was the avatar of the American century, a pragmatist who believed in mass production, direct action, and the ruthless arithmetic of logistics. That moment in the trailer in August 1944 was the inevitable collision of these two worlds. It was the moment the United States stopped being a participant in global affairs and became the architect of them. Eisenhower's no was not an act of disrespect. It was an act of maturity. He understood what Churchill could not accept, that in modern industrial warfare, sentimental attachment to the past is a liability. The world we live in today, the NATO alliance, the American military footprint in Europe, the geopolitical division of the continent, was forged in the fires of that disagreement. By refusing to bend to the will of a legend, Eisenhower secured the victory. But he also signaled the dawn of a new era. The British Empire had held the line when all was lost, but it was the American machine that crossed the finish line. And in the cold, hard light of history, that is the only metric that matters.